Hi, welcome. I started this new channel so I could kind of share my thoughts on things that I've consumed or things that I, in general, have thoughts on. And today, I thought I would do my first video on this channel about Pride and Prejudice. Sorry if this picks up a lot more noise than I thought. This was a digital recorder I found at Goodwill a while ago, and it was like for $1. And I thought it'd be cool to use this to create the video, and I could also listen while I speak, so I'll know when things get pretty loud. But yeah, Pride and Prejudice, I got to reading this because I had read, I am currently reading The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky. And for those who don't know, it's quite a lengthy book, and I really am enjoying it so far, but what I have to do, personally, is about every 100 pages, like, my edition is 700 pages. Oh, I dropped it. So this is my version, and the text is quite small. Let me just... Yeah, so the pages can be pretty tough when there's not a lot of dialogue, and it's just like a full thing of text. And for me, I need to constantly, the way my mind works is I need to take a break from the worlds I'm in, and I kind of need my mind to step into different worlds, different spaces and different worlds, so it can take a break after this, so I can actually really digest it. If I read it and tough it out, or take a break from reading, it kind of bores my mind, but I also can get fatigued from reading something like this, and I really want to enjoy it fully, so that's why about every 100 pages, it's kind of a arbitrary number, it just kind of depends on what I'm reading, but every 100 pages I kind of switch to a new book. The thing is, I usually switch between reading a classic and a contemporary, so the worlds are much more drastic. What is that noise? But for some reason, when I reached about page 400, and something was telling me to read either Pride and Prejudice or Wuthering Heights. I think it was mainly because there had been a recent announcement of the adaptation for the new Pride and Prejudice limited series that's supposedly coming out next year, and I've already known about the Wuthering Heights adaptation that's coming out around next year. That one's going to be a film, and I think that just kind of made me a bit curious, because I knew about both pieces of work already, and I don't know, I guess Pride and Prejudice seemed more at the forefront for me because the 2005 adaptation, which I had watched already, the film adaptation, is leaving Netflix at the end of this month, so I thought, let me finish the book, and then I can go rewatch it, and kind of give more fleshed out thoughts on the film as well. I wrote some points here, and I'm not really adding any new thoughts. I have nothing groundbreaking to introduce, as this book has been around for a little over 200 years. But one thing, when I was writing down some notes, I noticed that this book was written in 1813, and for some reason, I thought Dostoevsky's books were older than Jane Austen's. So that was really interesting. When I looked up the dates, The Brothers Karamazov was made in 1880 or something like that, and it it was his last book before he died. And then I had read Crime and Punishment already, and that was made in 1866. But for some reason, I thought Jane Austen was more of a writer during Victorian England, which is the 1860s. And she's not. She's before that. And I thought, I don't know, I kind of associate Victorian England with more gothic stories, I guess. So I thought Jane Austen's pretty flowery and feels lighter and not gothic. And it felt very freeing. Or, freeing is probably the wrong word, but it felt lighter. Not really, in my mind I have like light colors for Jane Austen and like gothic dark colors for Victorian England. And I thought because it felt so much lighter that it would have been after the 1860s, but it is not. It is literally the early 1800s. So that was pretty interesting for me to learn. I wrote down some short, notes about what I was intrigued by when I read this and what caught my attention. In general, the plot didn't really catch my attention. It was something I already knew about, especially because I had watched the film already. So that wasn't something I was looking to get surprised by. I think, I'm a linguistics nerd, so I thought the language in this was pretty interesting to observe, but it was nothing crazy. I think it was just in its flowery language era kind of the time, which did bring me to the point of thinking about the contemporary and novels that are written in the contemporary time, or of its contemporary time as well. And it kind of made me think about how appreciative I am of the contemporary novel, because as I was reading this, I thought it was so rich in how Jane Austen has managed to observe the society around her and the behaviors of the people around her, and she was able to create such a full picture of the British society that she was living in at the time. So much so that it's an important imprint, which I personally think is as important as non-fiction books about the same time period Jane Austen was living in. You get a sense of the polite society that they were brought in, the economics, even though it's more subtextual, you can get a sense of that world and the context and the situations that these people, the character she introduces to us, you can kind of get a sense of the stakes for them. And even though the stakes aren't as equivalent to modern day, you can see what was important to them at the time. And it's an interesting contrast to what's important to us now. I think one interesting fact I took away was, not fact maybe, but one observation I noticed was about how rich Mr. Darcy is. And I think you can draw these points about different parts of this book, but this is kind of one point I wanted to illustrate, was how much you can get, how much more depth you can get if you really want to dig into the society that Jane Austen was living in. For example, with Mr. Darcy's richness, he gets, I think it's at £10,000 per annum, and I looked up, what does £10,000 per annum really mean? And when I looked it up, there was an article about someone who did the math, or someone who was in an economics class relating to literature, and there was a lecture from an economics professor talking about how much things costed back then to now. And his earnings per annum, just not even including rent. That was the thing that they specified, was it was not even including all the other assets he would have been making money off of. This was just I forget specifically how he was getting that 10,000 pounds per annum, but it was equivalent to about 500,000 pounds, it's not exact, but around 500,000 pounds, which is equivalent to almost $1 million USD. And I was like, oh, so he's just earning that much passively. That wasn't even him collecting rent income, and he was considered as a land gentry, like in the land gentry class or something like that. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. So there's stuff to dive into about this society simply because she observed it and wrote about it as one of her characters. And I'm sure the stakes at the time, this was something I wrote about in my notes after reading, was the stakes at the time seem like incomparable to today. I think the stakes of love is kind of the consistent theme with the modern day society, but some things it's just like I couldn't be bothered to care for, but that's simply because I'm American. I grew up from an immigrant family. I'm in the present day of 2025. But there's just like the stakes at the ball, the stakes of these little meetings that they have at the different parks. I understand how they were so high stakes at the time, which is probably why this became such a popular book in her period. But it just wasn't translating to me, which is fine. I've read books like that, and I think the equivalent feeling I've had to that was when I would read YA books when I've already grown out of it and the stakes seem higher than they actually are. And I chuckled to myself because I was thinking, this was probably considered the YA novel of its time. And I thought that was pretty cool. But drawing back to the point for the appreciation for the contemporary, I already mentioned that it's cool that it can illustrate the time period that this author is living in. And I was thinking about the other books I kind of have read already, and I've read sci-fi and dystopian, but I've been reading Sally Rooney's stuff. I've read Normal People and Beautiful World, Where Are You? And I'm about to read Intermezzo eventually. And one thing I can say about her writing, even though I don't 100% love it, I'm not like a diehard fan, but I do very much appreciate the contemporary that she's writing in. She's writing in her, especially Normal People, when you get a full sense of the contemporary Irish society, or even a glimpse of it. I think it's so cool how much of an imprint that can make in the future because you've just observed the world around you. It seems so simple, but it's something I don't know, I just really appreciate that, and it's kind of like a, whoa, it's giving you insight into that world that was existing at the time. I don't know. I thought that was pretty cool. Another point that kind of got me spiraling, which I haven't fully fleshed out this idea, but I'm thinking of making a little atomic note about it, is the idea of the British polite society. And Pride and Prejudice fully demonstrates the British polite society. And I've heard about it, and I've kind of watched it through period dramas, but this felt like full effect of the British polite society. And I wrote a couple bullet points. This was before I kind of wrote some more bullet points. I'll see if I can find them in my computer somewhere, but I wrote about, this is a topic I'm still exploring, but about how the British polite society lends itself to British comedy regarding restraint and suppression of language, which forces people, or in this case, the characters in Pride and Prejudice, to speak in subtext. And I guess the thing I really observed about polite society is, in polite society, you cannot be direct and forward, which I feel is kind of a trademark American thing, is to be very direct and straightforward. But in British society, that's kind of not necessarily looked down upon, but that's just not the nature of the way they speak. And so when reading these conversations that these characters are having in Pride and Prejudice, you can see how much information they want to give, but they can't, because it would be considered rude. And it even gets, spoilers, but this book has been around for 200 whatever years. Lydia gets into a bad marriage deal with Mr. Wickham. And the thing is, Mr. Darcy knows about his character, and Mr. Darcy only secretly told Elizabeth Bennet about Mr. Wickham's character. But Mr. Darcy didn't want to spread the bad word about Mr. Wickham because that wouldn't be very polite. But because of that politeness, it actually gets Lydia to a bad marriage situation with Mr. Wickham. So Mr. Darcy starts to feel guilty about it and decides to fix that up in his own way. The thing is, reading about that, it was like, oh, why didn't he tell everyone about how bad his rep is, how bad Mr. Wickham's rep is, and everyone would have been saved by the plot. But that's the thing, is in British polite society, there would be situations that arise like that, because some things cannot be said. It's kind of like this weird social contract that everyone's signed into in this era, in this British polite society, that there are things that can be said and there are things that can't be said. With that being said, I think that creates a lot of fun situations such that Jane Austen has illustrated. Okay, sorry, there was like a plane that flew over. But I think with the things that can be said and cannot be said, that creates a lot of fun situations and scenarios that Jane Austen has taken advantage of. I guess that's not the right phrase, but has been able to illustrate, bring up, and she's been able to play with those situations and create essentially what is the situational comedy, where your characters are in a situation where they can't say a certain thing that needs to be said, and what do your characters do? And it kind of brings them into an absurd state, which brings out the comic part of that situation, which is you can't say something that needs to be said. And so I thought I would want to explore kind of the linguistic side of that, about how, and maybe a bit of like sociology behind that, about the British polite society and how that restraint and suppression of language in that society has brought out the standard for the situational comedy, and how that's evolved into modern British society and modern British comedy. And I kind of wanted to contrast that a little bit with the state of US comedy in comparison to British comedy, because I've noticed that I like to consume a lot more. Like, British comedy is more of my vibe. It's dry, it's witty, sarcastic humor, and not to say American humor is not like that. It's just the situational comedy that America presents is more direct and forward. Like, I think, like, I'm thinking of The Office, the American version, versus something like Fleabag, right? It's, when I'm watching Fleabag, I can see there's things that she can and cannot say, and she plays with a lot of those situational comedies, especially in the second season. where she falls for a priest. Well, spoilers if you haven't seen Fleabag, but that in itself is a situational comedy because there are certain things you can and cannot do considering the character of the priest. Versus The Office, where it's like, it's a situational comedy where all the characters work in an office, and there's different situations that arise, but the comedy is more physical comedy, I would say, maybe. I don't know. I'm still thinking about it, but that's generally what I wanted to explore with this point. And the other point I wrote down was how there was a focus more on duty and honor as respectable. Duty, honor, and manners as respectable. I think that's kind of just a general point. I don't know how much I'd really dig into that, but yeah, it was just interesting to see how people were tied down to their duty, their honor, their manners, and how Jane Austen managed to play with the idea. And there was one thing I picked up on, which kind of, I don't know if I'll mention it really in this video, or like fully go into it. Maybe I'll do it for another video if there's enough interest, but let me just dig into my notes. There was a quote that I saw. There was actually two quotes I saw, and they're both towards the end of the book. So this was a quote in the book that wasn't actually a dialogue quote. It was Jane Austen describing Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth after they had just confessed that they each reciprocate each other's feelings. And the quote was, "The happiness which this reply produced was such as he had never felt before, and he expressed himself on the occasion as sensibly and as warmly as a man violently in love can be supposed to do." And I laughed when I saw that, actually, because I had just finished watching this movie called Brief Encounter, and this was a movie that was made in 1945. Sorry, it's windy. 1945 in the UK. And towards the beginning of that movie, when the main character, Laura Jessen, is about to tell her husband, Fred, that she had this emotional affair with this man named Dr. Alec Harvey, but she's going to tell it to him as in the guise of a dream. She says this line so I heard this line before I had read that line in Pride and Prejudice, and the line that she says is, "Oh, Fred, I've been so foolish. I've fallen in love. I'm an ordinary woman. I didn't think such violent things could happen to ordinary people." And I was like, whoa. So this movie in 1945 and this book in 1813 both described love as violent. And I just created a new atomic note, and I titled it, "Is Love Violent?" And I was like, oh god, why is this going to be one of the first notes I decide to kind of explore? Because that in itself is kind of, I'm not going to have a direct yes or no answer. But I thought it was so interesting that these two different time periods, like about, what's the math? And they both describe love as violent. And then I kept reading Pride and Prejudice, and this is when Mr. Bennet, Elizabeth's dad, is kind of making a joke about, I think, some of the married couples or something. And the line is, "Had it been your uncle's doing, I must and would have paid him, but these violent young lovers carry everything their own way." And I was like, is love violent? Why are they describing it? Why are they consistently describing it as, like, them being violent? And then, to bring it back to Fleabag, I remembered about that priest's sermon, which I'm not really gonna read the whole thing about. Love is awful, love is painful. I was like, what is up with this discussion of love being violent, because personally I never really took love to be so violent. That's not necessarily the first way I would describe it. So that's kind of a topic I forayed into, and it's kind of on my mind because it's just so interesting that aggressive language regarding love and depicting love as this aggressive thing. So I thought that was so interesting, and I wrote like a whole note thing called Is Love Violent? And I kind of explore, is love violent? I didn't want to make it too long, but yeah, maybe in another video if people are interested in what I discovered and what my current conclusion is, because I'm sure it'll change over time. I'll share that. But for now, that's all I have about Pride and Prejudice, I think. Let me just double check. Now I pretty much covered most of what I wanted to. Yeah, I don't expect many people to watch this. This will be the first video. But yeah, I'd love to share some more thoughts on other things. And yeah, have a good one.